Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Adam Thomas, the Executive Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Stuart Lecture Series on Institutional Corruption in America. For those of you who are not familiar with the Madison Program, we are a program dedicated to exploring enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. If you would like to learn more about everything that we do, please visit our website at jmp.princeton.edu and follow us on X at Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our podcast, Madison's Notes, and learn more about all of our upcoming events. Some of you may remember that last spring's Stuart Lecture by Bill English focused on the corruption of the news media. This year's lecture hits a little bit closer to home and has as its subject the university and its corruption and the possibilities for reform. We are fortunate to have as our Stuart Lecturer this year a recognized leader in the movement to restore liberal education, not only in theory, but as a practice, Jennifer Ann Frey. Jen is a professor of philosophy at the University of Tulsa, where she was for 2 years the inaugural dean of the Honors College. Prior to Tulsa, she was an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina, where she was also the Peter and Bonnie McCausland Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Frey has published widely on virtue and moral psychology and has edited 3 academic volumes on virtue and human action. Her current project is a book on the ethics of Thomas Aquinas. She has also written widely in non-academic venues such as the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and hosts a philosophy, theology, and literature podcast called Sacred and Profane Love. She earned her PhD in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh and her BA in philosophy and medieval studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. Her lecture today is titled, "What is a University and How Can We Recover It?" Please join me in welcoming Professor Frey. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Adam, and many thanks to the James Madison Program for the invitation. Very thrilled to be here at Princeton in the fall, which is a nice break from what in the South we call autumn. Okay, so my topic is not exactly a happy one. The corruption of our institutions, particularly the corruption of our universities. However, I am hopeful that it is a hopeful topic. So I proceed this afternoon from the general principle that we should never let a crisis go to waste. But I have in mind here not the more specific crisis of the humanities. That would be a slightly different, though related talk, but really the crisis of the mission and identity of our universities. So I'll just go ahead and put my thesis on the table. And that is the answer to the question, what is a university? Is that a university is an institution that should be dedicated not simply to the pursuit of truth and the production of new knowledge, but the pursuit of wisdom. Therefore, it should be an institution that is ordered around the business of promoting and protecting liberal knowledge. And if we want to recover our universities, we need first to recover authentic liberal education within them. So I'm going to approach the question of what liberal education is by a kind of via negativa. So I'll just start with what it's not. It is not specialized disciplinary knowledge. And I think the idea that our universities are primarily dedicated to specialized disciplinary knowledge can be laid at the feet of several prominent figures, but I'll just stick to one, and that is Max Weber. In 1917, the great sociologist Max Weber was invited by a group of university students in Munich to launch a lecture series on intellectual work as a vocation. So the students were members of the Free Student Alliance, a group that championed the idea of the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, Bildung, and academic freedom during a time when these ideals were under pressure from disciplinary specialization, state interventions, market pressures, and a world war. Addressing about 100 students in a lecture hall, Weber delivered an address that was surely deeply unwelcome to them. Because rather than give a defense of their lofty ideals, Weber gave an account of scholarship as mere expertise, undertaken with no ultimate horizon of meaning or purpose. Weber embeds his conception of scholarship, which is Wissenschaft, within his more general diagnosis of modernity as a period of disenchantment. Now, enchantment for Weber is connected to magic. A literal translation of the German would be demagication. Whatever is magical on this view, it seems, is whatever cannot be shoehorned into the ontologies, epistemologies, and calculative rationalities of the natural and social sciences. The modern university is an institution that must inevitably reflect this basic condition of modernity, and it will dictate what sort of knowledge it will be legitimate to pursue within it. So within the terms of Weberian demagication, all that scholarship could be is specialized expertise of a particularly narrow form. So this is Weber. In the present era, scholarship in both the sciences and the humanities has entered an apparently permanent phase of specialization unlike anything that has gone on before it. We can feel sure that we have achieved something of real scholarly value only insofar as we have specialized to the utmost degree. Weber further argues that the scholar is a professional expert who labors in the service of increasing our repository of objective facts. He's emphatic that it is not, and this is a quote, a gift of grace with seers and prophets dispensing holy objects and revelations, nor a part of sages and philosophers' meditations on the meaning of life. Real scholarship leaves totally unasked questions of meaning and value. This can be left, presumably, to the priests and the prophets, but it is certainly not the business of the scholar, and any suggestion to the contrary reeks of the charlatan and the demagogue. Weber further yokes the notion of scholarly work to a technical notion of progress that is unending. So future scholarship does not necessarily build on the foundation of the past, but rather makes the past obsolete. Tradition on this view of progress carries with it no special authority or value. It's deeply unclear why anyone would study Aristotle, for example, beyond someone who was interested in intellectual history. And I suppose that some people will always pursue that as a line of work, but for most people, there is no reason to learn what Aristotle thought or said about anything. It's a bit of a dead letter. So Weber's notion of progress has no transcendent horizon that is worthy of pursuit for its own sake. So what then is the meaning of scholarly work on Weber's account? Weber's answer has three parts. First, scholarship gives us more techniques for controlling and calculating life. It helps us to master nature. Second, scholarship gives us methods of thinking that are internal to disciplinary knowledge. So it gives us analytic skills of the trade that sharpen the mind. It's good to have a sharp mind. Third, scholarship gives clarity about the means to whatever ends we have adopted. But what scholarship emphatically does not and should not do is tell us which ends we should pursue, or deign to think that it could help us make serious judgments about these ends. To render a judgment of value would be demagoguery, an abuse of power by the scholar. This is the inevitable result of the forces of Weberian disenchantment, which create a situation in which, and this is a quote, the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life and are simply a matter of private choice in the private sphere. Weber has very little to say about teaching in his lecture on scholarship, other than to note that excellence in scholarship is causally unrelated to excellence in teaching, which is surely true. And who besides overgrown children believes that advancing in scholarship tells us anything about the meaning of the world? Rather, and this is another quote, if scholarship can do anything, it is precisely to uproot and destroy the belief that the world has any such meaning. So one question that presents itself here is what what disciplines can count as Wissenschaft, right? What disciplines can produce Wissenschaft on Weber's view? Well, he's helpfully clear that it could not be theology, as theology violates the terms of modernity as he has outlined them, and therefore can be no part of a modern university. So this is Weber. All theology is an intellectual rationalization of religion's sacred domain. Every theology presupposes that the world must have a meaning and asks how to interpret this meaning so that it might be graspable by the mind. Now, Weber's totally fine with the academic study of religion, so long as it does not go further than describing the meaning that various world religions have purported to find. Anything more than this, alienated, merely academic mode of inquiry would bring the magical into the disenchanted halls of the academy. It's unclear, actually, what he would say about my own discipline of philosophy, but certainly we can guess that he would scoff at my own intellectual labors on wisdom, happiness, virtue, and the meaning of life, as I have the audacity to purport to say true things about such matters and present my beliefs up for rational dialogue and debate, and of course, he does not think that that's possible. So I think the most prominent contemporary Weberian is Stanley Fish. In his famous book, Save the World on Your Own Time, Fish argues that the trouble universities are in today is that professors want to do someone else's job and not limit themselves to their own. So what is the professor's job, according to Fish? He has only two roles. One, introduce students to bodies of expert knowledge and traditions of inquiry. And two, equip students with the analytical skills that will enable them to move confidently within these disciplinary forms and engage in independent research if they wish to do so. In a way, Fish's vision is even narrower than Weber's, as he would insist that any notion that what he does is useful to anyone else is ridiculous. And I take this to be a difference in their disciplines, right? Weber's a sociologist. Fish does English poetry. Fish is silent about what bodies of knowledge and traditions of inquiry students need to know, or why they should need to know them, as I think he must be, as this would involve a value judgment on his part, and this is strictly forbidden. But he is clear that no matter what you study, you must remain distanced from the material you study as, quote, merely academic, thus ensuring that the stakes are very low for everyone involved. So you can analyze arguments and claims, you can interpret and debate the strengths of the positions of others, but what you cannot and should not do is engage in a personal search for what you believe is the truth of the matter that would affect how you understand yourself and how you ought to live in order society. Fish's defense of this limited job of the academic is that the university is the institution dedicated only to the pursuit of truth, and that the pursuit of the truth must be a merely academic enterprise that has nothing to do with soulcraft. Students are not on a quest for wisdom, as university study has nothing to do with happiness or wisdom or human flourishing. Indeed, Fish mocks those who would pretend to be, quote, wise men, gurus, and saviors. The professor's only obligation is to present the academic material on the syllabus and introduce students to the, quote, state of the art of the methods of analysis. He is careful not to mention that the state of the art in his own discipline is radical theory attached to a very particular form of left-wing politics, but I will leave that aside, as that is part of the talk I'm not giving on the crisis of the humanities. So let us think about how Fish might understand my own discipline of moral philosophy. In an ethics class, he insists students are not, as Aristotle would say, engaged in a practical science that should change how they live. They are learning the ways that philosophers have structured their inquiries and reflections about morality, no more and no less. What makes moral philosophers worth studying is not the answers they give, but, and this is a quote, the verbal, architectonic, or argumentative skills they display in their writing. This is Fish. The genuine inquiry in which students are engaged is not an inquiry about what kind of person they should be, but an inquiry into what kind of person Plato or Hobbes or Rawls or Milton thought they should be and for what reasons. Exams must only test knowledge of Plato, not knowledge of what is true, considering what Plato has in fact argued. Why it is important to know what these dead men have said about the good life is left totally unaddressed and somewhat mysterious. In the end, Fish says that he is defending the proper limitations and prohibitions of what he calls the research ideal. But that ideal is an invention of the mid to late 19th century, so fairly recent in the history of the university. And I think it's safe to say that it hasn't been so awesome for the humanities quite generally, certainly not for philosophy in particular. It seems to me, then, that a reminder of the actual history of higher education in this country matters, or should matter, to how we think of both its present and its future. So if you indulge me for just a few moments, I will review that. Higher education in the US began with small liberal arts colleges run by clergy and grounded in a classical curriculum taught by tutors rather than specialized professors, and then this went on for roughly 200 to 250 years. Students were expected to receive a liberal education that prepared them for any variety of fields or occupations, and thus they studied subjects like rhetoric, logic, philosophy, classical languages, math, science, and ancient history. The curriculum was entirely prescriptive. Students studied what the president of the college believed that they must. Tutors understood their purpose to make their pupils happy and virtuous men of order, unblemished morals, and industry. Capstone courses for graduating seniors were non-accidentally in moral philosophy, since they purported to graduate gentlemen with the proper moral dispositions and habits of mind that could go on to any number of careers or further courses of study after graduation. Tutors and college presidents understood themselves as acting in loco parentis for the young men that filled their campuses, and the moral formation of these pupils was paramount to the enterprise. Now, the German influence on American higher education in the mid to late 19th century caused a sea change in how universities organize, understand, and evaluate themselves. By the late 19th century, the CV became the basis of hiring, and the lecture or the graduate seminar became the dominant form of university instruction. The telos of the university was similarly transformed. Now, it was to create new knowledge rather than to pass on received wisdom, modes of enculturation, or the cultivation of personal morals. This change in the university's self-conception necessitated a change in the curriculum and the basic structures of the university. So universities, beginning with Harvard, switched from a prescribed curriculum to an elective system. The elective system eventually gave rise to the now familiar balkanization of knowledge into majors and minors, and along with that, a massive explosion of departments and fields of studies, all of which was based on the idea that the students' passions and inclinations and political projects should be the basis of a university education. One important part of this transformation of the university's self-conception was the creation of the contemporary professoriate. The self-conception of the professor as a knowledge worker was born. A good professor is measured by his publication record and impact in his field. The adoption of the publish or perish mandate meant that facially neutral measures of meritocratic success in the university became yoked to the production of disciplinary knowledge. The best professors would be rewarded by having little to no teaching responsibilities. Undergraduate education becomes an afterthought, and the general education curriculum, a mostly incoherent set of requirements that might be addressed within a variety of disciplines, was delegated to graduate students, adjuncts, permanent lecturers, whose power and reputation within the university were little compared to their high research-focused counterparts on the tenure track. Generalists disappeared. Wisdom, not surprisingly, disappeared as a norm as well, and was replaced in the best case by truth, but more common than that, other ends crowded in as the goal, as some disciplines began to question the concept of truth and truth claims as just another vehicle for domination and control of others. Now, if Fish and Weber are correct, then the liberal arts college ideal was always a weird and illegitimate medieval holdover. And only the research ideal is defensible in our new age of disenchantment and alienation from ultimate ends and forms of knowledge that go beyond mere expertise. What's really strange about Fish is that he insists that his ideal has Aristotle and St. John Henry Newman as its forerunners. But Aristotle's conception of liberal education and Newman's idea of a university, which is very explicitly based on it, I think could not be further from the vocation of the scholar as advocated by Fish. So I'd like to turn to that explication and ultimately to its defense and path for recovery. So now I just want to talk about Aristotle and the liberal arts and Newman's university. So Newman's idea of a university was written in 1852, 12 years before Weber was born. And in this series of lectures, Newman advocates for the idea of a university that is focused primarily on liberal knowledge that is sought for its own sake, as this cultivates a habit of mind that befits a free person. For Newman, a university is concerned first and foremost, not with the advancement of new knowledge, but its diffusion and extension through teaching. Now, Newman's definition of a university has nothing essentially to do with Christianity or the church. The university is defined by Newman simply as an institution dedicated to liberal education and thus to seeking and teaching universal knowledge. It is an institution dedicated to seeking and teaching universal knowledge. Newman is most concerned that the university be a place where the whole of liberal knowledge is represented. It's not simply that no part of this knowledge can be left out, but that this knowledge must form a whole or be comprehended as a coherent unity. Like Weber, Newman speaks of knowledge in terms of facts, but unlike Weber, he thinks that we can know facts beyond what strictly empirical methods might deliver. He thinks we can have knowledge through intuition, through testimony, through abstract reasoning from first principles, and he gives credence to tradition as an authority that ought to be consulted on matters of great importance. But by whatever licit means we come to such knowledge, it will fit into a larger system or unified account of what can be known, of reality. So truth is not simply the grasping of disparate facts or making true assertions about particulars, but understanding these facts in relation to one another as a totality, as part of a comprehensive system that is universal. Newman is also working with an idea of progress, but by contrast with Weber's, progress is about making advances towards seeing how the parts of truth relate to the greater whole of truth. Behind this idea of truth is a conception of the universe, the totality of being or reality, as something intrinsically intelligible or knowable. There can be no universal knowledge without this concept of a universe. And for Newman, and this is really the key point, there can be no university without a universe and universal knowledge. So if we accept this model of universal knowledge as an ideal, right, a kind of regulative ideal towards which the university ought to strive in all of its intellectual endeavors, then we can see how all the disciplines taught within the university ought, at least in principle, to bear upon one another. Inasmuch as sciences are forms of knowledge, they ought to contribute to universal knowledge. And it follows from this that each science then must understand itself to be incomplete without the other sciences within the university, and each must recognize the respects in which the other sciences are contributing to the whole of universal knowledge. So all departments within Newman's ideal university must understand themselves as making a necessary but radically incomplete contribution to the whole of knowledge. Another way to say this is that each professor understands himself not merely as seeking the truth from within his disciplinary methodology and perspective, but as doing that for the sake of something higher, the universe or universal knowledge, or what is the same for Newman, philosophical knowledge, or wisdom. He uses those three interchangeably. For this reason, philosophy, the discipline which is especially concerned with the pursuit of wisdom, at least historically, has a privileged position in Newman's ideal university, much like it did in the medieval university. So here's a quote from Newman. The comprehension of the bearings of one science upon another, and the use of each to each, and the location and limitations and adjustment and due appreciation of them, this belongs to a sort of science distinct from them all, and in some sense, a science of sciences, which is my own conception of what is meant by philosophy, in the true sense of the word, and of a philosophical habit of mind. Ultimately, what Newman advocates is for philosophical knowledge to be communicated within every university discipline. He argues that as we move towards philosophical knowledge of what we study, we do that insofar as we can begin to see how the disciplinary truths are related to one another and how the truths they reveal, again, form a unified body of knowledge that is consistent within itself, right? And so it's going to follow from this that every university creature, student, and professor will need some serious training in philosophy. And this might prevent the current situation in which a very prominent biologist might publicly claim that the humanities have nothing to do with truth, since only empirical science arrives at truth. A bit of philosophical training would prevent embarrassment for such a person who, when pressed by the philosopher sitting next to him on the panel to define truth, or to show by scientific means that his theory of truth is the correct one, has nothing to say, as he has never been trained to think about or discuss what the truth is, or the different ways that truth has been or is currently sought, even within his own discipline, which of course involves mathematical truths. Now, I want to address Newman's account of what universal knowledge is for, because this is where happiness enters the picture, happiness understood in the old-timey sense of human fulfillment. The pursuit of universal knowledge, Newman thinks, is good in itself because we are rational creatures, and wisdom is a form of perfection for us. It is an intellectual virtue and not merely an analytical skill. Indeed, it is the highest power in us, ordered to the highest object we might study, the universe. Thus, as we acquire this habit of mind through our university study, we are advancing our own flourishing or perfection as human persons. There is no higher goal we could pursue, which is why such an education is truly liberal or befitting a free person, a person who is training himself to pursue higher forms of human excellence, not merely for his own sake, but for the sake of the common good. And a university is important to civilization precisely because it cultivates this highest form of human excellence. So here's a famous quote from Newman. Hence it is that this education is called liberal. For a habit of mind is formed which lasts throughout one's life, of which the attributes are freedom, patience, moderation, and wisdom, which I have ventured to call a philosophical habit. This is the special fruit of the education that is furnished at a university. The contemplative habits of mind that a liberal education cultivates is good without qualification simply because it contributes to human flourishing. It fulfills a natural human desire we have to know and understand reality that so impressed Aristotle in the opening of his Metaphysics and Plato throughout his entire corpus. It is this natural desire that is cultivated by a truly liberal education, specifically directing it towards the most universal and highest object of knowledge. It asks us not merely to seek the truth, but to ascend to the heights of wisdom insofar as we can, because our fulfillment depends on this upward movement from the particular to the general and the universal. Now, Newman was clear that there is wisdom to be sought within any discipline, so long as we ground the discipline in forms of philosophical or universal knowledge. In principle, both hold out the promise that there can be wise engineers, wise computer scientists, sociologists, and lawyers. The key is, again, to have the philosophical habit of mind as one is advancing through one's disciplinary bounds, so that one can keep an eye out for that wider horizon of philosophical knowledge of the universe. But however we settle questions about ultimate ends, we cannot know how to order our lives until we address them. And the question of ultimate ends is not one that Newman wants to leave to the private sphere. These are questions that belong properly to philosophy and theology, and I would argue literature and other disciplines, and not merely in a purely academic and alienated sense. It follows from this, I think, that the pursuit of disciplinary knowledge must have an ineliminable liberal foundation, so that when we think of general education, of what we think every university citizen must study, we should be thinking of a liberal education, an education that seeks to instill the habits of mind that are necessary for specialized knowledge to be at its best, in service of the higher knowledge of wisdom. Weber and Fish's ideal of a knowledge worker living out the research ideal, I think, really could not be more foreign to Newman's essentially Aristotelian conception of a university. And I also think it's out of joint with the vast majority of the history of universities in the West. For Fish's knowledge worker is merely an academic expert, and thus a mere technocrat who limits himself to the inculcation of disciplinary skills in which he has been narrowly trained. I think this has nothing to do with liberal learning, because there is nothing liberating about being trained to produce scholarship in Fish's narrow sense. Fish's account of the university is then, I would argue, opposed to liberal education rather than being a reasonable defense of it. A merely technocratic approach to higher education understands it as a training for a life of work, whether that is the intellectual work of the professor or the practical work of the engineer or entrepreneur. While such an education will always have its place in human society, a university education cannot be reduced to this and remain higher in any deep or meaningful sense that could distinguish it from a trade school. For no matter what career you choose in life, including the career of the professor, you will still have to know what your work is for, what your money is for, and what you are living for. And if you are never trained to ask and answer the question of what it is for, if we never let ourselves wonder in a disciplined way about who and what we are and where we are going and why, then I think we are not truly free. And then our free time is nothing more than a brief restorative period that allows us to work more efficiently and productively. We are only free in the relevant sense to the extent that we have cultivated philosophical habits of mind that do direct us towards wisdom, the cultivation of a vision of what is true, good, and beautiful that hangs together and makes sense for us in such a way that we can live meaningful and purposeful lives in accordance with it. Such a liberally educated person is free in the sense that his deliberations going forward will be guided by this vision of what it means to be a good human being and citizen that will inform the choices he makes, including, of course, his choice of what work he's going to engage in, but also how to contribute to the common good of the communities in which he finds himself a part. This is an interior freedom to flourish as human persons, not an external freedom. And if the university wants to tell everyone that such freedom is none of its business, then these matters should be left to priests and prophets and sages outside of our serious walls, where all the study is alienated and depersonalized and measured by its usefulness to something other than human flourishing, then we really need to question whether there is any difference between a university and a trade school after all. And it seems to me that the difference becomes more obscure every day. So that's what I think a university and a liberal education is. It's an old-fashioned view that I favor. So I just want to turn very briefly to some remarks about how we might recover it. I think we do this first and foremost by reclaiming general education as liberal. There are lots of ways to go about that. You might start an honors college dedicated to it. Good luck to you. But you might also adopt a common curriculum, right? A common core curriculum like Columbia or Reed. This will allow our universities to do two things at once: provide a liberal education to all, while still allowing for disciplinary knowledge and research to thrive. Well, I think we're at a stage where million experience and living are very important to our universities. We should also not lose sight of the profound need to reclaim general education as liberal. And I'd like to close with some lines from a Harvard Committee report that came out in the late 40s, which, like all university reports, just went in a drawer somewhere and nothing ever happened. But these are two things that the professors who wanted to save general education at Harvard said. The task of modern democracy is to preserve the ancient ideal of liberal education and to extend it as far as possible to all members of the community. General education is especially required in a democracy where the public elects its leaders and officials. The ordinary citizen in such a state must be discerning enough so that he will not be deceived by appearances and will elect the candidate who is wise. So I will end with the hope that our new civic centers will be places that recognize that liberal education is the education for a free person and citizen, and that they will be fearlessly devoted to offering it to undergraduates. Thank you for your attention. Should I take questions? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll field the questions for you. So we have plenty of time for questions. We have a mic that will come to you, so please wait if you're called on before asking to get the mic. It's a tradition of the Madison program to begin with any students who would like to ask questions first. I see we have a few in the audience. Would any of you like to be the one to ask the first question? Sounds like no. We'll just open the floor, then they can go to the front of the queue if they raise their hand. Any questions? From anyone? Yes, in the back, Professor Byers.
Thank you very much, Jen. Is it on? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
I don't know if it's on, but I can hear you.
Okay, good. I'm very sympathetic. I love John Henry Newman's idea of a university. One thing that I have experienced in teaching first at liberal arts colleges a couple of times and then teaching in a, what we call an R1, Research 1 university, is that a problem develops, which is that now to teach the great books, there's so much work that needs to be done in reading comprehension, even on the part of the professor, to know what the technical terms mean. So if you didn't have a classical education yourself, including Greek and Latin, a lot of times you might not understand a given passage of Descartes where he's reacting against scholasticism, for example, Aristotle's view of the soul-body relation. So the difficulty I have found is that you really need experts even to teach an gen ed curriculum of the great texts. And the situation we have now is that, we have sort of a bifurcation in the professoriate where we have people dedicated to teaching intro classes who a lot of times are part-timers. They may not even have a PhD in the field, or they're not doing much research in the field, so they don't have expertise. And then we have the experts who are teaching only electives and doing their own research. It's kind of an insoluble problem, I suppose, at this point in time, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I do. Thank you for that question. So you're pointing to the fact that the way that universities are currently construed, it works against liberal education. And I agree with that. However, I want to push back against the idea that you need expertise to teach Descartes. I think you don't. So I'll just use my own experience as an example. So my first job was at the University of Chicago. I was a junior fellow in the Society of Fellows for the Liberal Arts. And the Society of Fellows was created by Dean John Boyer to teach the core. Right, so remember that at the University of Chicago, the undergraduate college is the smallest thing there. And, because it really was the first institution that was birthed as embodying the research ideal, unlike an institution like this, which went from a small liberal arts college into a research university. Chicago was a research university from day one. Now, I taught in the original Great Books Corps, which means that the first thing that I had to teach was Homer. I had no idea how to teach Homer. Right? I'm a philosopher. There are no arguments in Homer. There's nothing like to analyze there. And so I am freaking out. And, but what I realized, like, very quickly is that no one wanted me to be an expert in Homer. That wasn't the point. And it was fine that I couldn't read Homeric Greek. The point of the discussion of the Iliad was about what does it mean to be a good human being and citizen? And in the epic poem, we were being presented with an ideal. And the point was to tease out that ideal as best we could as a class and to discuss it. There was no pretense that we were producing scholarship. There was no pretense that I was an expert. I was liberated at some point to be like, I don't know. You should investigate that. I have no idea. It was a completely different way of teaching and learning. And at first I was freaked out, and then I was like, this is the best thing I've ever done with my life. like I just was so, this was a very transformative experience for me. Would not teach or be the way that I am if I hadn't been kind of thrown into that. And there was also a culture built around the core. So we had junior fellows and senior fellows, and we were all teaching the same syllabus. So we could all talk to one another, like, how are you teaching this? What the heck do you do with the catalog of ships? I'm at a loss with that. That's like really boring. Is that important? There are places like this, like at Reed. If you're going to interview at a job for Reed, they're going to be like, so you're going to teach Homer, and you might be a biologist, right? And so that, I think, is a culture shock for professors because, again, that goes against all of our inclinations, right? Like, I have to know who Descartes was responding to. You don't. I think the simple reason is that you don't, because the meditations or the discourse on method or whatever it is that you're teaching is part of a longer conversation that you're having with students. And it's okay if you don't know this or that point. The more you teach it, the more you are going to learn. But this is a style of teaching that discourages secondary literature, right? It's not, the point isn't to read a lot about what other people thought about the text, but to try to extract a meaning. And so it's the opposite of what Fish is putting forward, right? The point is, what did Hobbes say? Well, we have to have some sense of what Hobbes said, but the point isn't actually what did Hobbes say. The point is it true? Is this true? Is this how the human being is, the vision that Hobbes is putting forward? So what I have found in working with professors, I didn't work with graduate students on this, but I worked with lots of different professors, is that you're really pushing them very far outside of their comfort zone. But once they start doing it, most of them enjoy it. That was certainly my experience. So I kind of think you learn by doing in this case, and it's just okay that you're not an expert. Yeah, it's totally fine.
Yes, you have a question in the front.
You mentioned the Columbia program
Yeah,
on contemporary civilization.
yes.
That seems to be quite up your alley as to what should be done.
Yeah.
And it isn't in most universities, is that correct?
I think the Columbia Core is a good example of the sort of thing that I have in mind. I don't think it's perfectly executed, but yeah, I think it's pretty great.
Another question I have for you is, what do you think is the impact currently of intercollegiate sports, especially at a place like Tulsa, which prides itself on NILs and transfers among students in many colleges, and the thing you know best about a college is a wave of 40,000 red shirts all waving on a Saturday afternoon, but they're not waving at the Rhodes Scholars.
Yes. So I have a lot of thoughts about collegiate sports. I'll say a few things. I will say that for the vast majority of schools, the current situation is simply unsustainable, right? So collegiate athletics in football and basketball have become a pre-professional league. We pay our athletes. Athletes will soon have agents, and the transfer portal will continue to wreak havoc on the entire system, because as soon as you're good, you're going to leave your institution, right? And this will have effects on general education, actually, because of the ways that that is regulated. And so I think, the NCAA is a feckless institution that has allowed this to happen. Not much to do about that. It's not sustainable for most schools. And it, unfortunately, many schools find themselves in the position where they are cutting academics to pay their athletes. And that is a huge problem that no one really knows how to solve right now. And I don't personally know where all of this is going. If you had told me 5 years ago that the Pac-12 would dissolve overnight, I would not have believed you. So I truly don't know where it's going, but I know that it's not sustainable for most schools, and will be, someone is going to have to figure that out. Certainly for an institution like the University of Tulsa, it's absolutely not sustainable. We had to find $5 million in our budget to pay our football players.
Where does that leave you?
Not in a great position. And I also think, and I support athletics. I think athletics is good. But what I don't think is sustainable and I don't support is collegiate athletics becoming a professional league, which is the situation that we find ourselves in. How we get out of that, I don't know. I think some schools will just opt out of the whole thing because it's just not sustainable for them. And then you'll see a kind of consolidation. But it's already so hard on our athletes. Our athletes now have to travel enormous distances to play schools that should not be in their conference.
Yes, Sophie Pangel in the back.
Thanks. I wanted to ask more about core curriculums, especially comparing a system like, I think Columbia has everyone reading the same text, so does a school like St. John's, and on the other hand, you have programs like UChicago's core curriculum, which has become more fragmented.
Yeah, it's become more diffuse.
Or nine choices for each feature of the core curriculum. Do you think one of those is more conducive to the vision of the university that you've sketched out, as something in between, most conducive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the core curriculum is very institution specific. One, because faculty have to teach it, so they have to be on board, right? It can't really be just like imposed. Administrators, I mean, part of the work that has to be done is getting faculty to buy in. That is really hard to do. I mean, there's one reason why nobody wants to touch general education. It is hard. That is a tough nut to crack for a variety of reasons. However, right, we have to do hard things. I think, so I think when you're thinking about how to reconstitute general education in the direction of making it more liberal, you have to kind of work with what you have rather than what you would ideally want. For us at the University of Tulsa, because we were an honors college, because an honors college is typically 10% of the population, although in our case it was 25 to 27% of the overall undergraduate population. So bigger, yes. We had more freedom and autonomy to do that, but we still had to get professors to buy in. And some professors, walked away from it because they were not comfortable teaching outside of their disciplinary bounds. It was something that they felt was, I don't know, just something that they couldn't do or wouldn't do. And so we had to be like, that's fine, this is voluntary. And then we had to find another faculty member who would. The Columbia Core is a very interesting case because it started out as a small honors program, was wildly successful, and then they went bigger with it. I think our best hope now is to start with smaller programs or colleges or what have you, and then kind of grow it in a sustainable way. And again, it's just going to be institution specific. I think what really matters when you're thinking about doing it is your understanding that general education should not be an incoherent set of requirements that might be satisfied in any number of ways, but to think about it holistically in terms of the standards and goals of a liberal education. Like, start there, see what you can convince people to do.
Yes, in the back.
So I'd like to begin by giving you a little context. I'm in my 57th year in the college, University
great.
of Chicago.
Yeah.
And I went to graduate, so you understand that undergraduate experience.
Yeah.
I went to
Yes.
graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh.
Oh.
In philosophy of science in the mid-70s.
Oh, wow.
And the first course I TA'd, somebody asked the professor at the beginning of the course, if it's on the midterm, will it be on the final?
Yeah.
And of course, the right answer to that, but do I need to know it for the final? Is you need to know it for the final and for whenever it's relevant in the rest of your life. And unfortunately, you gave the wrong answer.
Right.
And I'll tell you who it was afterwards.
I might have a few guesses.
Maybe we're past the time where you need to make a pitch to what I'll call employers, to consumers, of students who get a general classical education, why that's valuable, why you have 2 applicants from, say, the same state, large state university. Don't shun aside the one who took the honors program and read the classics in favor of the one who took more computer science classes. And if you have an argument, I'd be very happy to hear it, and if not, I urge you to think about how to make that argument.
Yeah, so thank you. So a kind of funny thing that's been happening to me in the last 2 years is that a lot of people from the tech world reach out to me. And these are people with truly mind-boggling amounts of money. And they are very interested in great books education for their employers. And I just find this really fascinating to talk to these people about the reason why. And, you know, I'll just say that no one is closer to the reality of what's to come than these people in the age of AI. And these are people who recognize the need for a very deep, formative kind of education, now more than ever. And so I truly believe that people are waking up to the fact, especially employers, to the fact that the product that we're putting out is not up to the task. Right, and this is a particular problem as students are able to get through college by cheating, right? It's incredibly easy to cheat. But the reality is that you have only cheated yourself. And these people are not lasting in their jobs because they didn't really receive an education. And as AI becomes so sophisticated within its own limited parameters, the element that is truly missing is something like wisdom. It's not skills. You know, it's not candle power. AI has more candle power than all of us put together, right? It's about having a vision and wisdom, and that is what a liberal education can deliver. And so I think people are waking up to that. I truly believe that they are. Now, are those people university administrators? No. But they'll wake up too, I think, eventually.
Eric, do you have a question?
Thanks. Sign me up. I'm on board with the vision you've offered. Maybe 2 tensions.
Yeah.
One follows up on the previous question. And at the end of your talk, you talked about education for a free person.
Yeah.
Which I think of in terms of, you know, maybe opening up to metaphysical inquiry and virtue.
Yes.
And education for a citizen.
Yes.
So not so much the problem of fishes, knowledge worker, but how do you talk to, say, state legislators interested in worker citizens? And it's related to the place of where STEM is in the well-done vision. Yeah. And also the public imagination, because it always just risks cliched latitude, I think, when people defend the liberal arts. Yeah. As a kind of in relation to citizenship. So I kind of just invite you to say something about, is there a tension between educating free persons and educating democratic citizens?
I don't think that there has to be. There can be. But I don't think that there has to be. I think that there is, you know, I found myself in a series of conversations that pit civic education against liberal education. And I've always tried to say in those conversations that What we really should be working towards is a blending of those two things. And I think that they are in many ways complementary while being distinct. And I think that one of the challenges of these new civic centers, which are very new and very much million experiments in living, and I wish them all the best, is to try to do that work of blending. Because we really do need both. Some people have argued that liberal education is education for democracy. I think that can't be right? Liberal education has flourished in times that are not democratic at all, and has struggled in times that are democratic. So I don't think that liberal education is education for democracy, but I do believe that liberal education is essential in a democracy in a way that it might not be so essential in other forms of social political organization. If we are putting forward a model of self-government, right? Then we need to have people who are self-governed and free, and so liberally educated. And so I see them as just deeply related, and it's non-accidentally the case that when we look at curricula, it does include, like so many of the great masterworks of political philosophy, right? Because the question of what it is to be a man, to be a human being, is embedded within the question of what is it to be a member of a society. And that just has to do with the nature of the kind of thing that we are, a language-using rational creature that has to be habituated in communal forms of life. Right? So for us, they're just so deeply related. So I think what you want is a blending there. And whatever tensions come up in that blending, you try to resolve them. Yeah.
Just quickly, another tension provoked by your saying, in your teaching, you learn by doing. And maybe could you say something about the education in wisdom and how it relates to education in virtue? Just because I'm thinking about someone like Aquinas thinks, well, more virtue we learn by habit, not simply by cognition. Yeah. A lot of the early Christian tradition was pretty ambivalent about the liberal arts as a site of moral formation, rather than a site of just production of knowledge. Both Aquinas and Augustine, I think. So, what's the relationship between the education in wisdom and education in virtue? And I think it's related to the question of public universities and pluralist societies too, because I think one of the reasons Augustine was hesitant about the liberal arts is because it was always in the service of the state of the empire. And not to mention maybe some other philosophical concerns about how we actually are morally formed. But what's the relationship between wisdom and virtue?
Okay, yes. Okay, big question. Very good question. So I take it that you are leaning into the division between intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Intellectual virtue being obviously habits of the intellect, but inculcated through teaching. Whereas moral virtue is habituation of appetite in all of its variety, and is mostly by way of, something a little bit, like obviously, if you want to grow in fortitude, don't go to a lecture, right? Like it's not, you could go to a lecture, you could go, there you go, that's right. Go to a really boring one, grow in fortitude. So, I mean, I obviously, I respect that. However, I think it's a mistake to use that division as a wedge between what I would call sort of like paideia or something like that in the university. So think about intellectual virtue. Just think about good habits of thinking and reflecting and reasoning. You still need moral virtues for those. For example, patience, humility. There's all kinds of moral virtues that you need to have a flourishing life of the mind. And in particular, virtues that you need for your seminar to be a place of real learning. So we talked about this a lot in the Honors College. For example, we talked about civility as very important for the pursuit of wisdom, because the pedagogy was dialogical and dialectical. So it's a lot of talking, a lot of conversing, not just in the classroom. Our students lived together. They had a set curriculum, so these are students who are up arguing like all the time with one another. You actually have to have norms of civility for that to proceed in a way that is actually going to lead people further down the road of wisdom rather than something else. I mean, the desire for knowledge itself is an appetite that needs to be regulated in the studium. That was an insight that Aquinas had. No one has written more beautifully about studiositas. Well, maybe Augustine. So I think, we are an integrated person. We can never just work on the intellect and pretend that we can isolate that. And so my idea is we focus on, we called them the virtues of liberal learning. And so we weren't going to focus on chastity. Didn't really seem apropos or like something I wanted to be involved in any way with my students. But of course we could work on humility and patience and things like, and studiositas, docility. Docility is hugely important for the life of the mind. So that's what I would say. And I think Aquinas is with me on that. But we could have that argument later.
Mike, I'll leave first and go over to Dimitri.
Thanks. I'm very sympathetic with the overall thrust of your argument, but I have a question about, as you rightly put it, I think, a gen ed curriculum, a liberal education has to posit some sort of coherent vision of what an educated person is, and that seems to depend on a coherent vision of the universe as something ultimately intelligible and questions of value, and as susceptible to rigorous evaluation. And the sort of story you told picks up with people like Weber, though, who seem to be responding to what at least appears to them to be the sort of debunking of those hopes.
Yeah.
Is to say the universe isn't fundamentally intelligible.
Yes.
Questions of value are not intrinsically
Yes.
adjudicable. Is it possible to establish a coherent gen ed curriculum without overcoming that initial challenge? Like, so do you have to just pretend that didn't take place, that those intellectual developments didn't take place? Do you have to just posit one? Pick a theological point of view or something and construct a gen ed curriculum around it?
Yeah.
How do you, where do you find the core of this core curriculum?
Yes. Such a good question. I think it's very institution specific. Some institutions can pick a theology, right? Because they're wedded to one. But that will not be most of our institutions. And even some that are will choose not to. And they have important reasons for choosing not to. So I think that's something at the level of an institution, like you kind of need to decide that. But despite the fact that, for example, many people in the humanities in the contemporary academy like don't believe in truth, right? It's still the case that they have to pretend they do in the classroom, right? They make claims that they at least have to like facially treat as truth claims. And of course they do that, right? And they're still making rational arguments, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do think that, you know, universities at least have to take a kind of idealistic posture of saying, yeah, we operate under some kind of regulative ideal. It's kind of like, you know, Kant says, well, you just have to postulate God, you know, to make it work. Does God really exist? I don't know. But I know that my system needs him. It's kind of, I mean, I think there's a certain kind, I mean, at some point, you just have to set the debate aside and recognize that if there's no truth, like, what are we all doing here? What is all this talk of knowledge? Like no university professor wants to, sorry, no university president wants to go out there and say, we are the university where we recognize this is all will to power, right? That's not, like somehow that doesn't register, and I don't think ever will register. And so I do think, yeah, like, of course, our universities are always going to be sites of deep contestation, and that's great. The medieval university was a site of deep and dramatic contestation, right? Second stint at the University of Paris, like, basically killed Aquinas. Deep contestation. So that's always been the case. It will always be the case. That's fine. But we do have to operate under these regulative ideals, I think, or just the whole thing doesn't work. Yes.
Great, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this. My question is pretty similar. It's also sort of about favor, I guess. Or more specifically, I guess it's about the difference between the hard sciences on one hand and the interpretive moral sciences on the other. So, yeah, if you teach courses on ethics or something like that, you're going to teach controversial questions.
Yes.
You're going to teach about abortion, euthanasia, that kind of thing. And I take your point to be, and I agree with this, that there are answers, rationally knowable answers to a lot of these ethical questions.
Yes.
But it still would seem quite inappropriate to grade papers, for example, based off of whether or not the student has reached the right view. The way we grade papers on the ethics of abortion, for example, is going to be on the quality of the reasoning, the quality of the argument, and in some way, kind of unique to the normative and interpretive science, or distinctive to the normative and interpretive sciences, we separate the question of, is this a good argument from, does it reach the correct view, in a way that you don't in hard sciences. Now, the 19th century liberal arts college that you're referring to, it was, not to mention Aquinas' university, it was perfectly happy to say, if you profess false views, we expel you or we fire you. And we are, I think, rightly committed to the principle of academic freedom that doesn't let us do that. But so if we're not going to be Weberians about why it is that, or if we're going to think that there are rationally adjudicable, knowable moral facts, why do we still properly, in my view, grade or approach discussions about these fraught moral questions this way, as opposed to in a matter of a simpler way of thinking about rationally knowable facts?
I mean, I think you're overselling the unity in the medieval university, like, by a lot. Just look at how the medieval university actually went about its business. You had the disputation, right? A disputation only gets going if you have a dialectical question. And a dialectical question is a question that does not have an obvious answer. And because it does not have an obvious answer, one must dispute all sides. That was the fundamental academic exercise. So this idea that in the medieval university there were just right answers, that's false. That's false, and demonstrably so. And the fights in the medieval university, which came to blows and arrows and condemnations and, poor Thomas having a mystical vision / nervous breakdown. They were over these theological, philosophical questions, which were very, very much disputed. So I think you're just always going to have that with human beings, like it's great. I think it's great. I'm a philosopher. There's nothing I love more than just arguing all night until I just can't do it anymore. That's just how I am. That's the way philosophy has always been, right? And you're correct that, how do you win a disputation? But by having the best argument. How else could you win it? And the fact that human beings can't seem to come to agreement, about these things, I think is just, a reflection of our finitude and other things. And, there are ways that we try to resolve it. I'm a Catholic, so we've got a pope who just will say it's this. And you kind of have to go with that once it's been said. But we don't have that in our liberal democracy. We don't have that in our universities. We will always be a site of contestation and disputation. I think it's great. But for a lot of these, for so many of these fundamental questions, and I would also dispute that this is not a problem in the hard sciences. They're open-ended in a way that demands the work that we do in the university, right? Which is trying to figure out how to settle it the best we can, knowing that in 500 years, we're still going to be arguing about this stuff. It's amazing. That's what I would say. Yes.
Reese, or was it a microphone?
Well, thank you. I'm wondering, what's been the effect of Quentin Skinner and very, aggressively historicist attitudes to the history of ideas, if any?
Wow, what a good question. You could go even further back than that. Gosh, do I have anything interesting to say about that? I don't know that I do. I'm a little bit stumped. I understand the force of your question because it's kind of look, a lot, and I brought up this point with Fish, right? Fish just wants to lean into expertise because he thinks that's safe, right? But if you, it's just disciplinary knowledge, it's just expertise, well, all right, let's take a peek under the hood of what passes for disciplinary knowledge right now in English or in history, right? And there's a kind of materialism and a kind of reductive account, which of course philosophically, I would dispute. So even the disciplines themselves are sites of contestation about how the discipline will proceed. Now, something will win out there in the sense that, hey, top journals are all, they've settled it in favor of this, and if you've got some kooky view, it's going to be hard to get in there, etc. Those are all just kind of realities. But you're asking a question that I think I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. Yeah. Is anybody here in history who could maybe say something more interesting than I just managed?
Thank you. This has been excellent. At the moment, most of the students that are picking these kinds of education, it's very self-selective, I believe, and that they have a thirst for this sort of significant education that is beyond just putting the words on the board and repeating them back. How do you expect, or how do you hope, that this will move to the general population? Because they have not had this in high school. They're not used to this sort of thought process at all.
Yeah.
How do you grow it in the student population?
Yeah, so there are certain questions of scale that I don't know how to solve. So, you know, I'm at Princeton, but 2 weeks ago I was at Arizona State. Arizona State has 80,000 undergrads, I think, and that's not including like the other 100,000 they have online. Like, it's really extraordinary how many students they are processing at any given time. And when it comes to an institution like that, I don't know. I just kind of throw up my hands and I'm like, I don't know. But I think at a place like Princeton or a place like Tulsa, something that is, you know, a more suitable size, I think that my experience with students goes like this. When you actually talk to them about why are we doing any of this? You know, sometimes I just will talk to students and I'm just like, why are you here? You know, I do a lot of programs for high school students, and that's the first thing that I ask them, why are you here? Why are you in this summer program? And they're all basically like, because I think it'll help me get into college. You know, and I'm just like, okay, right? Like, we need to talk about why you should be here, right? Because that's not why you should be here. And when you talk to students about like, why do we do this? And you tell them a different story. So the story that students hear really from kindergarten to the present is that education is so they can work, so they can make money. That's it. That's what it's for. They have such a thoroughly instrumentalized understanding of what an education is, that really the best thing you can do with them is to talk to them about the fact that the kind of education that we're trying to give you has nothing to do with work. It has nothing to do with work. Like, do you want to be happy? Do you want to be free? Do you want to be a person? What would it mean to be a person? What is a person? And once you start to invite them into that kind of reflection, their whole demeanor changes, right? They're just like, what's going on? What is this? They've never heard this before. They're intrigued. And so I really think it's about, you know, talking to them about what's at stake, which is their lives, right? Like, what kind of life do you want to have, really? And most of them, once you start engaging in that kind of reflection, will pretty quickly come around to the view that there is something more, there is something deeper at stake, and they will have a hunger for that. The tragedy is no one talks to them that way. No one even approaches them on that level. They take, you know, Fish's approach, you know, that it's totally depersonal, that it's like alienated academic modes of inquiry. And, you know, Fish is just kind of like, well, we've always done that. Are we not going to do that anymore? And the answer is, we're not really doing that, right? And yes, it's very easy to imagine a future where we're not doing it. Now, he's doing that because he thinks it's safe. Like, Fish thinks the main problem with universities is that they have been politicized. That's a problem in our universities, but I don't think it's the main problem. I think the main problem is that it's been depersonalized and dehumanized. It's been thoroughly instrumentalized. Yeah, and I think students understand that when you actually talk to them about it. Now, there's a question of scale there, right? How would I address 80,000 undergrads at ASU or 100,000 of them online, right? That is already kind of depersonalized. I mean, there's a bit of a factory system. And so there is a tension there, a tension that I don't know how to resolve between kind of openness and almost like a democratization of liberal education and the personal nature of liberal education. How do you scale it?
Well, I think that's all the time that we have, so we have to end there. Please join me in thanking Professor Frey.